I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unravelled show. Now, rock and roll emerged in the mid-1950s as an amalgam of both black and white musical roots. That's gospel, blues, jazz, jump blues, R&B, doo-wop, and then country, hillbilly, rockabilly and bluegrass, and that all fused and more subgenres to produce rock and roll. Now today we're going to be taking a look at the early R&B scene. That's the R&B scene before the advent of rock and roll in the mid-1950s. It all started with gospel music. Now, after the American Civil War in the mid-19th century, people moved north from the plantations, and they moved up to places like St. Louis, Chicago, Memphis. And by the end of the 19th century, the music was really starting to develop, and the syncopated rhythms of ragtime and the improvisational nature of jazz, well, they'd arrived. In 1928, James Boodlet Wiggins, now that's a name to conjure with, he recorded a song called Keep a Knockin' and You Can't Get In, and that's the original version of that. You might recognise the title. It was covered famously by Little Richard quite a while later. And in the 30s, the vocal harmony groups started popping up. I mean, the Mills Brothers released their Tiger Rag on Brunswick. Now, it's the same label that the Who recorded their early material on. That's been around a while. That was December 31, and that was considered to be jazz. Now, the term R&B wasn't coined until the late 40s, but more about that later. And in 35, the Ink Spots were in the recording studios at RCA in New York, and amongst the things they recorded on that 4th of January was Swinging on Strings and Don't Allow No Swinging in Here. Now, that was a skiffle favourite in the UK in the 50s, Mama Don't Allow. But the hard times of the 1930s drove many of the swing jazz big bands out of business. And jump blues came along and it filled the gap. Now, what happened was that the patrons of the dance halls needed smaller groups who could sort of match the volume of the departed big bands. The singers would shout and the saxophonists would honk, and that gave the performance names like Shouters and Honkers. A wonderful time. And jump blues was a sort of up-tempo, jazz-tinged style of blues, usually a vocalist in front of a large horn-driven orchestra or a medium-sized combo with multiple horns. You can see a theme developing here. Now, the style was earmarked by driving rhythm, loud vocals and saxophones, lyrics full of bravado and swagger, and a lot less reliance on guitar. The guitar now very much became a rhythm guitarist situation. And jump blues also had a hard rhythmic drive, and the snare beat emphasis was on the 2 and the 4, very much a precursor of rock and roll. Jump blues bridged the gap really between the older style of blues and the big band sounds of the 1930s, and innovators here were people like Joe Turner, Louis Jordan. Now, the term R&B wasn't coined until the late 1940s, and there was a massive overlap between the various genres: blues, jazz, jump blues, doo-wop, R&B, and the crossover from one genre to another is really quite hazy. So we're not going to concern ourselves too much with trying to pigeonhole artists and tracks. But in 1939, a guy called Rodney Sturgis released So Good on the Decca label, another label that's been around a long time. And now he was backed by Louis Jordan's Elks Rendezvous Band. Now, Louis Jordan became a big player in the 1940s with his Timpani 5. They had 57 R&B hits on the Billboard R&B Top-40. We need to remember, though, that the Top 40 Billboard R&B hits didn't start until 1942. So he would have had a lot more than 57 between his 42 and 51, because he was recording very much in the 1930s. Now, in March 1939, one of his earlier ones was Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5 with Keep a Knockin'. And the label information's great. It describes it as blues vocal foxtrot. and Keep a Knockin' and You Can't Get In, mentioned earlier, was around from 1928 with the original by James Boodlet Wiggins, and Little Richard's cover in 1957, and an awful lot of covers between 39 and 57, I can say. Now, Louis Jordan is Timpani 5. He managed to get 2 songs into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. One was Caledonia from 1945. That was his 11th R&B hit, and that was a number 1 for 7 weeks. And in 1949, he had the wonderfully titled Saturday Night Fish Fry, Parts 1 and 2, so both sides of the single. And that was his 50th R&B hit. As you remember, he had his last R&B hit in 1951, and that was number 1 for 12 weeks. So across the 40s, he was very, very popular. R&B was born in the mid-1940s in the clubs of St. Louis and Memphis. Now, St. Louis was a large, wealthy city, and it can employ a larger number of jazz and blues musicians. And R&B really was evolving out of the simpler blues music, adding more instruments. It was more upbeat. It was very much designed for dancing. And Big Joe Turner was coming into the frame now in 1945. He had his first R&B hit with S.K. Blues. And one of the most influential of the record labels was also born in 1947, and that was Atlantic Records, formed in New York by Ahmet Ertegun and Herb Abramson. And apparently they paid 3 to 5% royalties when other labels were paying less than 2%. And one of the earliest tracks I can find released on the Atlantic Records label was St. Louis Blues by Boyd Raeburn. But they had their first big hit with Stick McGee and His Buddies in April 1949, and that was with Drinking Wine Spodod. And that gave Atlantic its first big hit, a number 2. Now, Drinking Wine Spodod was originally recorded by Stick McGee in 1947, but the label there credits it as just Stick McGee and His Buddy. So obviously he made a few friends before moving on to Atlantic and recording it again a couple of years later. And another real classic hit the streets in 1947, and that was Roy Brown with Good Rockin' Tonight. Now, he wrote it and originally released it, but he didn't really do a lot until Wynonie Harris picked it up in the middle of 1948. And he had a number 1. It was his third R&B hit, and of course Elvis chose it as his second Sun single, and it didn't actually take it into the charts, but the September of 1954 saw Elvis releasing Good Rockin' Tonight. Now, doo-wop developed as a sort of subgenre of R&B. What it was very much the birth of vocal arrangements with an overall feel of R&B. Harmonies used falsetto, tenor leads, and interesting enough, at the other end of the scale, as it were, the bass vocals became more prominent. They were given a lot more prominence than just background vocals. And the doo-wop lyrics as well were less suggestive in R&B, less raunchy. They were more sort of up-tempo, innocent love songs, but they did use a lot of nonsense syllables. Now, the term R&B is accredited to DJ Gus Gossett, and in an interview, he said it was a phrase he heard in a 1955 song from the Turbans, When You Dance. Now, the big bang of R&B is really credited to have come with the Ravens. And they had a lead bass vocalist called Jimmy Ricks, and they were the guys that introduced dance steps into performing. And these dance steps proved very popular with the later Motown bands, if you watch people like the Temptations and the Four Tops. But the Ravens released their first single in the summer of 1946, Honey, and their first R&B hit came a little later, at the beginning of 1948, with Write Me a Letter. And another big band at that particular time was the Orioles. They had their first single reviewed in Billboard magazine on the 4th of September 1948, and Billboard chose it as one of their Billboard picks. That's a new release, most likely to sort of gain airplay and chart, and they were quite right. It's made the #1 spot. Now, the Orioles and the Ravens weren't the first successful black vocal groups. They were preceded, as we heard earlier, by the Ink Spots and the Mills Brothers in the 1930s. But by the end of the 1940s, there was a new era of much more earthy black vocal groups. And the Orioles and the Ravens were right at the forefront of this new style that really came, and this was the style that became known as doo-wop. And they were followed by a multitude of sort of street corner vocal groups, some going on to international fame, not many, but sadly the genre generated a plethora of one-hit wonders. And as the 50s became the 60s, doo-wop ran its course, although the last Orioles hit came long before that. That was in 1953 with In the Mission of St. Augustine. Now, I mentioned earlier that the term R&B was coined in the late 40s. Well, to be precise, it was coined on the 25th of June 1949 by Billboard magazine, because that was the date that it changed the name of its charts from race music to rhythm and blues. And the guy responsible for this name change was Jerry Wexler. Now, in the 40s, America was a very, very segregated place. Even the charts differentiated between black and white artists. RCA Victor, the record label, had really started this trend away from the use of the word race music the year earlier, 1948, and they'd started to market its race music as blues and rhythm. But Billboard magazine, I say, 25th of June 1949, that was when the chart's name changed, and the best-selling retail race records chart became the best-selling retail rhythm and blues records, and the most played jukebox race records chart became most played jukebox rhythm and blues records. Jerry Wexler actually went on to join Atlantic in 1953. He was brought in when Herb Abramson, one of the founding members, was drafted into the army, and he was brought in very much to produce R&B for black audiences, to extend the reach of the record label. And one of the biggest artists of that time was Ruth Brown. She had her first R&B hit in the summer of '49 with So Long, and in fact she was so successful there that Atlantic Records became known as the house that Ruth built. And one of the most successful artists in that era was Fats Domino. Now, on the 10th of December 1949, he recorded The Fat Man. It was written by Fats Domino and Dave Bartholomew, and that day he recorded 8 tracks at Cosimo Matassa's J&M studios in New Orleans, and one of those tracks, The Fat Man, gave him his first R&B hit, gave him a #2. And The Fat Man's very much a contender for the title of the first rock and roll record. Now, Fats Domino's estimated to have sold over 65 million records. And essentially he sold more records than any other 50s rock and roller, with the exception of Elvis Presley. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. Now today we're taking a look at the early R&B scene. That's how it was before the advent of rock and roll in the mid-1950s. Now around 1950 a doo-wop group called the Royals formed, and that was with Levi Stubbs. Now, he went on to form the Four Tops in 1954, although they were called the Four Aims when they first got together. Now, another very, very influential R&B record label, Chess Records. And it was the mid-50s when Aristocrat became Chess Records. And that was the Chess brothers, Leonard and Phil. They took complete control of the Aristocrat label and renamed it to Chess Records. And the first Chess release was Bless You, coupled with My Foolish Heart by Gene Ammons. And instead of being given the record number Chess 1, it was given the number Chess 1425. And that was taken from their childhood address of the Chess family home at 1425 South Karloff Street in Chicago. And the second release on Chess is an interesting one, and of course this is Chess 426, and that was Muddy Waters' self-penned Rolling Stone. And this was the inspiration for Brian Jones for the name of the new lineup, and that was the lineup after Mick Jagger and Keith Richards joined. And they debuted as the Rolling Stones famously at the Marquee in London on the 12th of July 1962. And one of the great R&B singles from the early 50s in May 51 was 60 Minute Man from the Dominoes. It was actually their second R&B hit, but it gave them a number one for 14 weeks. And that's another one of the contenders for the accolade of first rock and roll record. The lineup was Billy Ward, and the lead vocals are from founder Clyde McPhatter. Now, he went on to form the Drifters. And we keep talking about the contenders for the first rock and roll record. Well, 5th of March 1951, Jackie Brenston recorded Rocket 88, and that's very much cited as the first rock and roll record. And it was written by Jackie Brenston, recorded at Sam Phillips' Memphis Recording Service studio, and it was released on Chess, because at that time Sam Phillips hadn't actually got his Sun Records into gear. Now, the session was arranged to record Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm, actually arranged by Ike Turner. And Turner's band cut 4 tracks that day. Piano player Turner took the lead vocal on Heartbroken and Worried and I'm Lonesome Baby, and that was coupled and released as a single by Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm. And sax player Jackie Brenston took lead vocal on Rocket 88, and that was coupled with Come Back Where You Belong and released as Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. Now, on the record, you've got some great fuzz guitar from Willie Kizat, and that's one of the first examples of deliberate distortion on a rock and roll record. And shortly afterwards, Bill Haley and his Saddlemen, before they were Bill Haley and his Comets, covered the song. And Rocket 88, well, that was actually a motor car. It was the Oldsmobile Rocket Hydromatic 88. And that went into the charts on the 12th of May 1951, and it was actually Jackie Brenston's first and only R&B hit. Another one-hit wonder. Gave him a number one for 5 weeks. And one of the really influential people of the times was Alan Freed, a DJ. And he started his R&B show on the 11th of July 1951, and that was on radio station WJW in Cleveland, Ohio. He was calling himself Moondog at the time, and he was one of the first American DJs to popularise R&B and introduce it to a wider white audience. He called his show the Moondog Rock and Roll House Party, and the show's theme was Blues for Moondog by Todd Rhodes. Now, Alan Freed's accredited with coining the term rock and roll, although a guy called Richard Whiting actually wrote a song called Rock and Roll back in 1934. So that's an interesting thought to ponder on. Throughout the 1940s, Freed appeared on radio and television as a sports presenter and DJ, and he was encouraged by local record store owner Leo Mintz to sort himself out with his own R&B show at WJW. And as popularity of rock and roll music increased, he became one of the most influential DJs on radio and television. I mean, his activities themselves actually expanded out, and he was promoting concerts, he was making movies. He had to drop the name Moondog after he was threatened with a lawsuit from Louis Thomas Moondog Hardin. Now, he was a legendary street performer who moved to New York in the early 1940s, and you could find him resplendent in Viking cape, helmet, and complete with a spear as he performed at the corner of 54th Street and 6th Avenue in New York. Now, in 1952, there was a doo-wop song called Stormy Weather, released by the Five Sharps on the Jubilee label. It's quite possible you've never heard of this record. You've almost certainly never actually heard it. I know I haven't. And it's considered to be one of the, well, if not the rarest doo-wop record of all. And that apparently sold in 2003 for $19,000. So check the attic. There might well be something up there. And 1952 was the dawn of a great artist's career. Sonny Wilson released The Rainy Day Blues on DG Records. Now, Sonny Wilson was actually Jackie Wilson. It wasn't a hit for him at the time, and that DG label was owned by Dizzy Gillespie. But in 1958, Jackie Wilson scored his first R&B hit, To Be Loved, and went on to have a phenomenal career. And one of the really great songs of the time, which you will definitely recognise, 13th of August 1952, Willie Mae Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog. It was her only R&B hit, yet another one-hit wonder, but it was number one for 7 weeks. So if you've got to have a single hit, that's the way to do it. And it was one of Leiber and Stoller's earliest compositions, and he was backed by the Johnny Otis Band. Now, the original writing credit gave it to Leiber Stoller and Johnny Otis, but Leiber and Stoller took a very dim view of this, and by the time the Elvis version hit the streets in 1956, Otis's name was no longer there, and Elvis had a top 40 pop hit with that. That was at number one for 11 weeks, and it was his 7th top 40 hit. There's another Elvis connection with our next record. The Orioles, with what was their 10th R&B hit, actually their penultimate R&B hit, in August of 53, they found themselves back in the R&B charts. This time it was with Crying in the Chapel. It's often said to be originally by the Orioles, but the actual original was by a guy called Darrell Glenn. He released it a month or so earlier. Now, he didn't manage to make the pop or the R&B charts, but the Elvis connection, well, he had a number 3 with that in 1965. So many of these doo-wop and R&B songs were covered by bands and artists in the 1960s. Absolutely incredible. A wealth of great music came out of this era. Now, on the 7th of May 1953, Clyde McPhatter signed to Atlantic. After that, he just left Billy Ward and the Dominoes, and he had a mandate to put together a new group, and that's when he formed the first Drifters lineup. And they recorded a number of songs, that first lineup, one of which was the McPhatter-penned Lucille. But the good suits at Atlantic were very disappointed with the result and sacked the band, with the exception, obviously, of Clyde. And he put together a new lineup with Bill Pinky, Andrew Bubba Thrasher and his brother Gerhardt, and Willie Furby, who was actually arguably a classic Drifters lineup. And they recorded Money Honey. Now, Money Honey took them into the charts in October 53, and they were the number 1 spot with that for 11 weeks. Now, the label credit's interesting. It's Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters, not simply the Drifters. And the Drifters is a really interesting band. I mean, they'd make a whole show in themselves. They went through a multitude of personnel. I mean, over 60, 65, 66, I think. And they're still performing to this present day, but there have been numerous versions of the Drifters performing simultaneously. Now, they actually also included half a dozen lead singers, and they had a complete personnel change overnight on the 30th of May 1958, when the band was sacked in its entirety and replaced with Benny King's band, who were renamed to the Drifters. But in the May of 53, the Spaniels recorded Baby It's You. It did give them a hit, but the really interesting thing about this was that was the birth of the VJ record label. And it's very famous because when the Beatles started having hits in the UK, their producer George Martin went over to America to talk to Capitol, which is the sort of parent company of, or the sister company rather than the parent, of Parlophone that they recorded on the UK, to interest them in releasing the Beatles on Capitol. But Capitol thought that there was no mileage in the Beatles, they wouldn't sell any records. So VJ picked up the Beatles. They never actually scored any hits in that year before Capitol picked them up, but well done to VJ for spotting a bargain. Now, a year later, they had their second hit with, that's the Spaniels now, had their second hit with Goodnight Sweetheart, and they delivered that, one of the all-time classic doo-wop songs. And I mentioned the Four Tops earlier. They formed as the Four Ames in Detroit in 1954, and they changed their name to the Four Tops to avoid confusion with the Ames brothers. Now, the same four guys in the Four Tops were together until 1997, when sadly Lawrence Payton died. And also in 1954, at the beginning, Johnny Guitar Watson recorded Space Guitar, and that's one of the pioneering works of feedback and reverb. And it was actually, he wrote the song himself, and it was released as Young John Watson. But who was Johnny Guitar Watson, and he was a favourite of Frank Zappa. He appeared a number of times with Zappa on stage and on record. 54 was quite a good year. I mean, the Chords recorded and had a number 2 hit with Shaboom. Now, that was originally another one of these that was released as a B-side, and the original A-side was their cover of Patti Page's Cross Over the Bridge, but DJs preferred the B-side, and Shaboom became a big hit. But sadly, the Chords are yet another one destined to the annals of one-hit wonders. But Shaboom actually brings us on to an interesting side issue with doo-wop and R&B, particularly doo-wop. Groups like the Crew Cuts, some very clean-cut white guys from Canada, and Pat Boone, another very clean-cut early rock and roll singer, they would cover these R&B originals, and they would be very much watered down versions of the songs, and sometimes they had more success in the charts than the original black artists did. Although interestingly enough, with the Crew Cuts, that wasn't an R&B or a pop hit in the US, but it did chart in the UK. So the UK gave the Crew Cuts a number 12 at the latter part of 1954 with Shaboom. And in the middle of 1954, Bill Haley and His Comets had their first hit with in America with Shake, Rattle and Roll. Well, it actually was their first hit in the UK as well. That charted in the UK at the end of 1954. But that was a cover of Big Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle and Roll. And it's quite an interesting one from a hit point of view. The Big Joe Turner version was an R&B hit. It gave him a number 1 for 3 weeks, but it wasn't a crossover hit. It didn't hit the pop charts, whereas Bill Haley's was a hit in the pop charts, a number 7, but that was never a hit in the R&B charts. So the people who decided what was and wasn't an R&B record had some interesting decisions over that particular one. And at the end of 1954, the Penguins achieved an R&B number 1 with Earth Angel, and that crossed over into the pop charts, number 1 for 3 weeks in R&B, and a number 8 on the crossover in the pop charts. It's interesting that now we're getting into 1954, late 1954, 1955, and a lot of the songs are starting to cross over into the pop charts. Another interesting thing about that was it was released in the UK in the January of 55, as was most of the R&B material, or an awful lot of it, and doo-wop. Very little charted, and this didn't chart in the UK either. And again, it's another one to check the attic out. If you've got a black label copy of this with gold writing, it could well be worth getting on for £2,000. But one of the most successful groups of that period were the Platters. Now, in 1954, they originally released Only You on the Federal label. And 18 months later, in the middle of 55, it was released again, but this time it was on Mercury. They'd had some success at Federal, but it was their move to Mercury that really brought them success. And the reason for that was Buck Ram, their manager, managed to do a 2-for-1 deal. He managed the Platters and the Penguins. Now, Mercury were very keen to get hold of the Penguins because they'd been very successful. The Platters hadn't really done a lot at this stage, but Buck Ram sorted out a 2-for-1 deal. Now, the Mercury version was a smash hit for the Platters on both sides of the Atlantic and started a run of hits which lasted into the early 60s. The Platters were one of the most successful of the doo-wop groups, and most of the singles scored on both the R&B and the pop charts. And Only You itself was written by the Platters' manager, Buck Ram. He actually wrote and produced most of their hits. And one for the record collectors, Only You was originally released on Mercury with a purple label to denote it was an R&B release. Mercury used different labels for different genres. Country and Western, for instance, was on a green label, but shortly after this Platters release, Mercury dropped the colour coding and standardised their releases on black labels. Only You itself was a crossover hit and spent 7 weeks on the R&B chart at number 1. Bill Haley and His Comets had their first R&B number 1 in early 1955, and that was Dim Dim the Lights. And of course, any look at R&B in the middle 50s has to include Bo Diddley. And on the 2nd of March 55, Bo Diddley was in the recording studio and cut Bo Diddley and I'm a Man, which were put together and released as his first single. Both sides credited to Bo Diddley, but you find the writing credit mostly on his records goes to E. McDaniels. And both sides gave him a whopping number 1. He'd been around for a while. I mean, that was 1955 when he got his first hit. And in 1946, he'd formed his first group, the Hipsters, and they became the Langley Avenue Jive Cats. Bo Diddley also designed guitars. And also, Bo Diddley was famous for his signature rhythm, shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Rock and roll essentially was born on the 25th of March 1955 with the American release of Blackboard Jungle. Now, that was based on a novel by Evan Hunter, set in an inner-city New York school against a sort of backdrop of teenage delinquency. The movie opened with a written preamble about the problems of juvenile delinquency, with the opening credits rolling to Bill Haley and His Comets' Rock Around the Clock. The reaction to the movie was absolutely immediate, kick-started rock and roll around the world. Now, that wasn't the first outing for Rock Around the Clock. It started life as the B-side of 13 Women, released back in May 54, but neither side troubled the chart at that particular point. But when it was released again following the movie, it spent 8 weeks at number 1. It was actually Bill Haley's 5th hit. And Rock Around the Clock also entered the R&B charts. Gave him his 2nd R&B hit. One of the really big stars of this time was Fats Domino, and he released Ain't It a Shame in the spring of 1955, written by Fats Domino and Dave Bartholomew. It was a big crossover hit. It was his 14th R&B hit, and it was an R&B number 1 for 11 weeks. And it also entered the UK charts. That gave him his 3rd UK hit single, and that was in the January of 57. And really the last guy we'll look at, and you couldn't look at R&B without him, it's Chuck Berry. He recorded Maybelline on the 21st of May 1955. He was introduced to the Chess Brothers, who owned the label, by Muddy Waters. And this first recording at Chess was based on Bob Will's 1938 recording of Ida Red. Now, early copies of the writing credit went to Chuck Berry and DJs Russ Frato and Alan Freed. And again, that was a nice big crossover hit, and yet another number 1 for a very long period of time, 11 weeks in this particular case. Chuck Berry, what a character. John Lennon said of him, "If you tried to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry." And even two of the biggest names in rock and roll overstepped the mark with plagiarism lawsuits. He took a dim view of the Beach Boys' Surfing USA, a little bit close to his 1958 Sweet Little 16, and even the Beatles' John Lennon song, Come Together. Well, that was a big story, and it was all about You Can't Catch Me, his 1956 single. What a guy. Well, that's it for another show. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show and the story of the early days of R&B. It's interesting to see how blues, jazz and jump blues all sort of came together with a little touch of other things to give us R&B and the vocally based doo-wop. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show as much as I've been putting the whole thing together. I also do a very detailed copy of the show as a blog on my website, and that's rockandrollunraveled.com. And it's also, as well as all the information in the show, it's also got links to all of the songs that I talk about in the show. So if you want to hear what some of these quite rare songs sound like, check out the website, and that's rockandrollunraveled.com. Now join me again next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unraveled.